Snoring. He'd gone to sleep in his own presentation. I am going to try to avoid that, and I'm going to try to avoid as well you're going to sleep at this stage in the proceedings. But it is a great honor to be at this college, and I'm particularly delighted that a class from one of the Christian classical schools has come quite a distance tonight to be with us. But it's great to see both old and young who are interested in the life of the mind and who are not settling to believe the current myth that Christianity is anti-intellectual. If there's anything we must do, it's to give the lie to that idea. And how it ever arose is very strange, because the very first commandment in the law, part of it says that we are to love the Lord our God with our mind. And the second thing I'd like to say is, and as we're talking about the origin of life, it's highly relevant, every academic discipline involves taxonomy, giving names to things. And that's something we delight in, and pure mathematicians particularly. Even I have invented a few names that appear to have stuck in parts of the field of algebra. But taxonomy, learning names, is a discipline because giving names to things is in a sense taming them. And what is very interesting in the book of Genesis is this, that there are 4 or 5 bits of the universe that God gives the names to. That ought to get you thinking as to why that is the case. And then God says to the first human pair, you go and name the animals. So it was God who started biology. And that is immensely important. The Bible is pro-science. It was part of the task that was commanded to be done for God. It's not simply that God is for science. It is that the original scientific undertaking was what God commanded people to do. And that is a very important thing to realize, that whatever our work is, we can do it for the Lord and to honor and glorify Him. So we are coming to a topic which you may find it rather strange that a pure mathematician is addressing, the question of the origin of life. Because I'm not a biologist, I make no secret of that, and you've listened to the experts today, but I notice that from Darwin to Dawkins, that biologists have tended to write for the thinking public. So I'm giving this lecture as, I hope, a member of the moderately thinking public, because the question of the public understanding of science is, of course, a very important thing indeed. Now, the background to the questions that arise about the origin of life involve us thinking a little bit about an extraordinary circumstance that occurs here and nowhere else. You see, if you think of Newton's laws, Einstein's equations, the mathematical description of the universe, at whatever level you have studied it to, there is no worldview or philosophy that you can deduce any of those equations from. You have to go out and look at the universe and extrapolate and do inductive argument until you get to a formulation of such laws. But there is one area of intellectual activity where the theory at the scientific level is very closely tied in to a worldview. You see, the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, and followed by Lucretius, who expounded his philosophy in this brilliant Latin poem that all of us ought to read, especially if we're from the classical education background, De Rerum Natura. And if you can't read it in Latin, you ought to be able to, but we'll let you off with reading it in English or any other language you speak. It was written about the middle of the 1st century, and in it Lucretius derives almost the entire theory of evolution that Darwin got. except for the transmutation of species. And he derives it from philosophical assumptions. He derives it from a materialistic worldview. Now, I explained a little this afternoon what that was, but crudely speaking, if you deny the existence of a transcendent God who is creator, and you're told that mass energy is all that exists, and you're asked, please give an account of the origin of life, you will take about 10 minutes to come up with a fairly convincing theory of evolution. That is, you can deduce it from the philosophy without any reference to evidence whatsoever. That doesn't prove it's wrong. But what it does mean is this, that here we have a most unusual circumstance where philosophy, worldview, materialism in particular, is very close indeed to what is described as a scientific theory. And the reason that we need to take this very seriously is that although it doesn't mean of itself that the biological theory is incorrect, it does mean that there may be so much a priori philosophical pressure from the reigning naturalistic paradigm that aspects of the theory may not be subjected to the wide-ranging, rigorous, self-critical analysis which should be characteristic of all science. And I want to suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that there are leading scientists who are realizing this. I want to give you one or two examples from contemporary literature. The first is from biologist Robert Reid. In his book, Biological Emergences, Evolution by Natural Experiment, he says, since neo-Darwinists are also hypersensitive to creationism, so there's the worldview thing, the antipathy to any kind of belief in a creator, they treat any criticism of the current paradigm as a breach of the scientific worldview that will admit the fundamentalist hordes. Consequently, questions about how selection theory can claim to be the all-sufficient explanation of evolution go unanswered or ignored. Now, here's a leading biological thinker saying that part of the attitude of his colleagues to this theory is motivated by purely worldview considerations, and it has led to a less critical attitude to those. And a major review of Robert Reid's work says that he argues convincingly that the selectionist paradigm is a conceptual dead end. That's very strong language for understanding innovation, since it mistakenly views natural selection as a creative force in evolution. James Shapiro, a leading biologist in the United States, makes a very similar point. In the context of earlier debates about evolution, insistence, he says, on randomness and accident is not surprising. Why? Because it springs from a determination in the 19th and 20th centuries on the part of biologists to reject the role of a supernatural agent in religious accounts of how diverse living organisms originated. Shapiro goes on to say that whereas that determination to reject supernaturalism fits within the naturalistic boundaries of science, the continued insistence on the random nature of genetic change by evolutionists should be surprising in light of the current empirical evidence. Now, that's saying a lot, and our experts, such as Dr. Nelson here, can point you to the detail behind this. It's really saying something that is not being generally taught, so far as I know, in either universities or schools, that there are serious queries being raised about this selectionist paradigm. Let me come now to a Nobel Prize winner, in case you think I'm citing people too low down the pecking order, although I assure you that these men are not. But let's come to a Nobel Prize winner who's a world expert on the properties of matter that make life possible. His name is Robert Laughlin, and he warns scientists about the danger of allowing ideology, worldview, to influence their thinking. And it's a very strong statement. Here it is. Much of present-day biological knowledge is ideological. Much, not just a little. Much of present-day biological knowledge is ideological. A key symptom of ideological thinking is the explanation that it has no implications and cannot be tested. I call such logical dead ends anti-theories because they have exactly the opposite effect of real theories. They stop thinking rather than stimulate it. Now, this is an evolutionary biologist talking. Evolution by natural selection, for instance, which Darwin conceived as a great theory, has lately come to function as an anti-theory, called upon to cover up embarrassing experimental shortcomings and to legitimize findings that are at best questionable and at worst not even wrong. Your protein defies the laws of mass action. Evolution did it. Your complicated mess of chemical reactions turns into a chicken. Evolution. The human brain works on logical principles no computer can emulate. Evolution is the cause. That is what some, not all of course, leading scientists are raising this question as to whether or not the debate is actually being steered by an ideological or worldview notion rather than a strict adherence to following evidence where it leads. And this has been picked up in a fascinating recent book by Thomas Nagel, who's a professor of philosophy in New York, and he's an atheist. And in his essay, Public Education and Intelligent Design, he says this: the purposes and intentions of God, if there is a God, and the nature of his will are not possible subjects of a scientific theory or scientific explanation. But, and here comes the important statement, that does not imply that there cannot be scientific evidence for or against the intervention of such a non-law governed cause in the natural order. So what Nagel is saying as a philosopher is that it's a legitimate scientific quest to look for the influence, the intervention, he puts it, of such a non-law governed cause. And I will shorthand that to God. There is a supernatural dimension outside. Now, interestingly enough, I find that my colleagues in Oxford, generally speaking, agree with this statement of Nagel's. We have a delightful professors' forum in my university where we meet to discuss serious things after a nice Oxford dinner. And on one occasion, they were discussing this very question. And after a lot of toing and froing, I put up my hand and said, look, I just want to ask a very simple question. Suppose we have a black box here, and we're assessing it scientifically. Is it scientifically legitimate to ask the question, can we detect whether there's been an informational input into the structure of the contents of this black box? And I went round the room and everybody said yes. Now that's very interesting because, of course, that is the key question behind the much maligned efforts of intelligent design. It's precisely that there's a scientific methodology that will allow you to detect the influence of this kind of external supernatural dimension. And interestingly, Nagel, in another book, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the Universe is Almost Certainly False. If ever there was a title designed to provoke the thinking public, it's that. It's a fascinating book. I've read it twice already. And interestingly enough, he says that based on reading of books like Michael Behe's Edge of Evolution, he concludes that intelligent design does not, I quote, seem to depend on massive distortions of the evidence and hopeless incoherencies in its interpretation. And then he says that he has for a long time been skeptical of the claims of traditional evolutionary theory to be the whole story about the history of life. He reports that it's difficult to find in the accessible literature the grounds for these claims. The present available evidence comes nothing close to establishing the sufficiency of standard evolutionary mechanisms to account for the entire evolution of life. Now, a side thought on the influence of ideology on this is shown by what Peter Atkins, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Lawrence Krauss, and all the rest of them do. They argue that there's strong scientific evidence for atheism. That's fascinating. So they believe it's legitimate to use science to defend a metaphysical position. So they, of all people, have no grounds for objecting to me doing precisely the same thing, to saying that there are scientific grounds for a Christian position. Please notice that. They themselves are confessing that these questions are accessible, because if you deny intelligent input and say that there are grounds for scientific investigation of that, of course, the flip side is there are scientific grounds for investigating the case for intelligent input. So they are giving the game away in this sense. Now, the interesting thing here is this raises a whole lot of very deep questions. And some of them are about the definition of science. Now, this is not the time of night, nor is my mind in a fit state, nor do you want to put up with it for a long discourse on this. You know, 99.9% of science doesn't raise these issues. People talk about methodological naturalism. I talk about methodological theism. They make very little difference when you're doing algebra or you're studying Einstein's equations or anything else. The vast amount of science is done without serious or even any influence of a metaphysical position. But when it comes to origins and these big questions, of course, that's where the metaphysics begins to come in. And that's where we need to look at what we mean by science. Now, we all know what science is until we try to define it. It's, as Augustine said about time, everybody knows what time is until we try to define it. And then we discover that no one knows what it is. But the general feeling is this, you see, that science is tied to a naturalistic explanation. Let me read philosopher Massimo Pigliucci. The basic assumption of science is that the world can be explained entirely in physical terms without recourse to godlike entities. And Christian de Duve, who again won the Nobel Prize for his research on life's origin, says scientific inquiry rests on the notion that all manifestations in the universe are explainable in natural terms without supernatural intervention. Strictly speaking, now notice this notion is not an a priori philosophical stand or profession of belief. It is a postulate, a working hypothesis that we should be prepared to abandon if faced with facts that defy every attempt at rational explanation. Many scientists, however, do not bother to make this distinction, tacitly extrapolating from a hypothesis to affirmation. They equate the scientific attitude with agnosticism, if not with outright atheism. So here's an admission from a Nobel Prize winner that in his view, science is essentially applied naturalistic philosophy. And putting it the other way round, the author of the major humanist manifesto, Paul Kurtz, another philosopher, he says what is common to naturalistic philosophy is its commitment to science. Indeed, he says naturalism might be defined as the philosophical generalizations of the methods and conclusions of the sciences. Now, this leads to all kinds of questions. You see, it's okay to restrict your questions to answers that come out of a naturalistic philosophy. But then you will never find out if there's anything more. Simple illustration, if I design a mechanism as a physicist that can only see visible light, and you come along and your name happens to be Röntgen from Würzburg in Germany, and you say, I've discovered this funny thing called X-rays, and I take up my machine and I say, well, there aren't any X-rays, just look at my machine. He might well say, but your machine is designed not to see them. And the difficulty is, in this area, we're looking at it through glasses that are designed not to see anything that is not explicable in naturalistic or materialistic terms. That doesn't prove they don't exist. Now, if there is a supernatural dimension, what would you expect to happen? Well, you'd expect to happen what does happen. That is, looking at how things work doesn't require naturalistic presuppositions or theistic presuppositions, and so you do lots of good science. But you will discover certain areas where the gap will increase rather than decrease. So the assumption is that life began without any third dimension, without any supernatural input. And Miller and Urey do their experiment in 1953, and they find some amino acids, and there's the secret of life solved. No, it isn't. We're now more than 60 years after that, and the gap has got vastly wider because they didn't know that the problem was not getting the amino acids, although they weren't able to get the right ones with the right atmosphere. The problem is getting them in the right order according to the DNA coding. That wasn't realized then. And so as people have tried constantly to investigate this on the basis of naturalistic presuppositions, the whole situation has become what looks to me like a serious mess. And before we look at what this mess actually is, it's very important to realize that origin of life, which is our topic tonight, and evolution of life are completely distinct topics. Now, Richard Dawkins is responsible for a great deal of the confusion on this issue, because in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he said what Darwin discovered, the mechanism of natural selection mutation, is the explanation, and I'm quoting now, for the existence and the variation of all life. That is simply false. And Dawkins has retracted it. He retracted it with me on the Charlie Rose show not long ago, as you'll see if ever it's broadcast. And he's retracted it in his most recent book. So he realizes, of course, that logically speaking, evolution, whatever it does, depends on the existence of a mutating replicator, and therefore cannot be used to explain the existence of a mutating replicator. That's simply a contradiction of terms, as was seen years ago by Theodosius Dobzhansky, the Russian evolutionary biologist. Pre-biological evolution is a contradiction in terms, is the point he made. So we need to realize when we're talking about the origin of life, using the word evolution is maximally misleading. Of course, people want to get the word in because it fills every gap, and so they talk about chemical evolution. But you need to watch that like the plague. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, Christians get constantly accused of believing in a God of the gaps, and they need to avoid that. But there's the other side that Robert Laughlin refers to, there's the evolution of the gaps. I can't explain it, but evolution did it. So it works both ways. And we need to decide these things on the basis of evidence. And James Shapiro, again, says in the book that I quoted earlier that there's a great deal of confusion still reigning because of failure to distinguish between questions of evolution and the origin of life. Now, of course, there are areas that are conceptually separate. The origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of increased complexity in terms of body plans and so on, the origin of consciousness and the origin of human life and rationality. These are all separate issues. But let's notice something before we plunge into this primeval soup. When we were talking about the origin of the universe, we used arguments from mainstream physics and cosmology. The fine-tuning of the universe is mainstream science these days. Now, that's not controversial. But when it comes to the biology of origins, it tends to be very controversial, and the press love the controversial. Now, the danger is this, that people do not realize that the arguments from physics and cosmology and the arguments about the origin of life and evolution are totally independent. What does that mean? Well, let's start. Biology, whatever you believe about evolution, depends on the existence of a fine-tuned universe because life is carbon-based. And that was one of the first discoveries by Fred Hoyle. At least he predicted it, the fine-tuning of the resonances that are needed to produce a large amount of carbon. Now, this is enormously important. Because of all the controversy over biology, people tend to think that Dawkins' arguments trump the arguments from cosmology and fine-tuning. They don't even put a dent in them, because all of his arguments depend on assuming them. So arguments, let me repeat it, because these things are difficult to get across. You need to hear them 500 or 600 times before you see what they're about. They are big, big issues. And I'm covering a lot of big issues tonight very rapidly. Fine-tuning in physics stands and is totally unaffected by any of the arguments about biology. That seems to me to be extremely important. And so if there is evidence from cosmology and physics, it has a very big implication, of course, that there's intelligence behind the fine-tuning, it is then much less irrational to bring the concept of an input of intelligence into the biological field, because there already is independent evidence for that possibility. So we can proceed a little bit, at least, to see what's going on. Now, I quoted C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis I quote a great deal. But when it comes to the scenarios for the origin of life, the views succeed one another, as Lewis puts it, with the restless fertility of bewilderment. Organic soup, a warm little pond. Fox's experiments, Eigen's hypothesis, Hoffman's contribution, Westerhuiser's hypothesis, ZN world theory, radioactive beach hypothesis, ultraviolet and temperature-assisted hypothesis, self-organization and replication, deep-sea vent hypothesis, RNA world, metabolism first, iron-sulfur, thermosynthesis, bubbles, pumice rafts, autocatalysis, Clay hypothesis, gold deep hot biosphere model, primitive extraterrestrial life, extraterrestrial or organic molecules, Fred Hoyle's panspermia, lipid world, polyphosphates, PAH world hypothesis, multiple genesis. Do you think I'm going to go into all those this evening? Well, I'm not going to. I'm not an authority on them. But the very fact that we've this vast plethora is sending out a little signal, isn't it? There is immense bewilderment, and there's an enormous amount of guessing, and it's digging deeper and deeper into the mud. Now, how can we cut through this? I want to make a suggestion, but then I'm only a mathematician. The biologist might not like this, but let me make a suggestion. I wish, and I do feel, that these hypotheses are worth investigating, of course, in detail, and that has been done. But I wish to go to the heart of what I think is the main issue, and that is to ask the following question. What are we looking at? What are we looking at? We're looking at life. And in particular, we are looking, now that we have had Watson and Crick, we are looking, well, let's Richard Dawkins introduce the topic. Why don't we give him an innings? Here we go. What lies at the heart of every living thing is not a fire, not warm breath, not a spark of life. It is information, words, instructions. If you want a metaphor, don't think of fires and sparks and breath. Think instead of 1 billion discrete digital characters carved in tablets of crystal. Let's do that then, and we'll follow Richard Dawkins. Life is digital information, says his colleague Matt Ridley at Oxford. And Bert Olaf Kuppers, a leading origin of life theorist in Germany, said the problem of the origin of life is clearly basically equivalent to the problem of the origin of biological information. And just a couple of months ago in The Guardian, Paul Davis of the ASU wrote an article on the origin of life, saying it was one of the great outstanding mysteries of science. And he says most research into it has been carried out by chemists who have tried a variety of approaches, and little progress has been made. Perhaps that's no surprise, given life's stupendous complexity. Even the simplest bacterium is incomparably more complicated than any chemical brew ever studied. But then he says this: a more fundamental obstacle stands in the way of attempts to cook up life in the chemistry lab. The language of chemistry does not mesh with that of biology. Chemistry is about substances and how they react, whereas biology appeals to concepts such as information and organization. Informational narratives permeate biology, genetic database, the genetic code, and so on. And he points out that the issue is the key to life's origin is not going to be buried in some baffling chemical transformation. It is to do with the origin of information. Now, let me put it this way. However life came to be, at the very least, it involves a text. I hope that gets you literary people beginning to ruffle your feathers with a bit of pride. It involves a text. And indeed, the word that is the human genome is the longest word that's ever been discovered. It's 3.5 billion letters long. Of course, not in the English alphabet, although you could put it in that. In a chemical alphabet of 4 letters. They're exactly in the right order. You can knock a few out and change them. But generally speaking, if you do that, you wreck the whole thing. It's like a computer program. Now, it's like many other things as well. That's not all there is to it. By far, that isn't all. But let's look at the basic thing, that we're dealing with a word that's contained in each of the 10 to 100 trillion cells in your body. And it's that word that seems to me to spell the death knell of a purely naturalistic origin of life. Because words, in all of our experience, do not originate from unguided natural processes. You see, ladies and gentlemen, it's so ironic to me that we now live in the information age. And the physicists are pushing forward, and some are following Wheeler's ideas, that actually information, not only is it not reducible to physics and chemistry, it may be more fundamental. And so you get marvelous articles saying it's not it before bit, it's bit before it. Now, that is profoundly interesting. Some scientists are now arguing that matter is quantized because the fundamental unit of information is the bit, 0 or 1. It is quantized too in that sense. It's a quantum unit. But this is astonishing because information is not material. And the great irony of the modern scientific, molecular, biological, and information revolution is we've come to see that at the heart of all living system is something that isn't material. So what's going to happen to materialism that says everything's material? Now, I know that physicists like Rolf Landauer have tried to make out that information is physical because it is usually carried on a physical substratum. But there's been a book by a colleague at Oxford that just knocks that out of the ballpark, pointing out that Landauer was wrong. Information itself is not material. It's not physical. So science has now come to the point where its major achievement leads us out of the materialistic worldview, and that opens up a whole lot of possibilities. This is serious physics that is now being plowed into biology, and I feel a lot more comfortable with it because, of course, it's getting nearer and nearer to my own field of mathematics. And you see, ideas of people like Manfred Eigen, the Nobel Prize winner, who says our task is to find an algorithm, a natural law that leads to the origin of information, is just not so, because, as again Paul Davies, who's not a theist, said, look, no laws of the kind we know could possibly lead to this kind of thing. Even Arthur Peacock of Oxford says in no way can the concept of information, the concept of conveying a message, be articulated in terms of the concepts of physics and chemistry, even though the latter can be shown to explain how the molecular machinery, DNA, RNA, and protein, operates to carry information. Now, this fascinates me utterly. Now, let's the mathematicians take over for a minute or two. Or should I say the theoretical computer scientists? You see, what we're talking about is the realm of protein machines, and the word machine is used. Now, machines are very interesting, especially if they process information, because there's a very famous theorem. You've heard of Turing, the famous English mathematician who solved the Enigma code and helped win the Second World War. He was a genius who invented the concept of a Turing machine. That is an abstract mathematical machine. It's an abstract concept, but that it can simulate any computer, past, present, or future. And the church Turing thesis is precisely that that's what it does, that there are no known exceptions to this. Okay, so far so good. Go to sleep if you're not interested in this. I'll wake you up in a minute or two. But the point is this, that at the level of machine, if the cell is an information processor, it can be simulated by a Turing machine. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because one of the founders of information theory, Leonard Brillouin, said a machine does not create any new information, but it performs a very valuable transformation of known information. So at whatever level, protocell, whatever it is, if it's a machine, it cannot create information. Go back a bit. The work of Gregory Chaitin, who's one of the most brilliant mathematicians alive, I think he's just retired from the Bell Labs, he says no Turing machine can generate any information that does not either belong to its input or its own informational structure. That would seem to imply, I'll not be dogmatic, let me undersell the case. That would seem to imply that no molecular device is capable of generating any information that does not either belong to its input or its own informational structure. Well, if that's true, that's the end of materialism. And that's not God of the gaps thinking. We can't explain it, therefore God did it. It's where the science is leading. You see, I am aware that there are negatives in those statements. No machine can do this. And people say, well, that's dangerous. Well, it is dangerous. Proving a negative is notoriously dangerous. But then you see, I'm a pure mathematician. And pure mathematicians, if they've been trying for 5 or 6 centuries to prove something true and they can't do it, they start to try to prove it's false. And sometimes they succeed. Now, there aren't many analogues of that in physics, but there's one very prominent one, and that is perpetual motion machines. And I have been party to receiving a big package in the post. Dear sir, I have got the plan for a perpetual motion machine that will run energy free and so on. I just throw it in the waste paper basket. Now people say to me, but how do you know he hasn't done it? How do you know he hasn't solved it? Well, because I actually feel there's strong evidence for the law of conservation of energy, that's why. And that prescribes it, so he's wasting his time. Could people be wasting their time looking for a naturalistic origin of life? Well, they could if it's like the perpetual motion machine and it's like this. Now, there's a lot more reasoning to be done here, but it seems to me that the pointers are streaming away. The more we understand of the nature of information, they're streaming away from the naturalistic worldview. So that as a scientist, I find it totally incredible. But I find my atheist friends find it the same way. Because I have a little experiment I do with them, you see. Let me tell you a little story because it's story time. I think it's story time. Yes, it's story time. Let me tell you a little story, ladies and gentlemen. We've got a lovely college, Green Templeton College, and we have lovely candlelit dinners every Thursday night. But the thing about those dinners is you don't know where you're going to sit. And sometimes that can be moderately embarrassing, as it was on one occasion when I found myself beside a very eminent biochemist. And he said to me, what do you do? I said, I'm a pure mathematician. Oh dear, he said, how boring. And he meant it, you see. So I backtracked and I said, well, actually, I try to make up for this social ineptness by being interested in big questions. He said, like what? Well, I said, like the status of the universe. Is it created or not? Oh, he said, goodness me. He says, far worse than I thought. Listen, he said, I'm an atheist. I'm a reductionist. We've nothing to talk about. We're going to have a very miserable evening. Well, it's a good start for a good dinner. So I said to him, now half a minute. I said, actually, we're going to have a great discussion. Are we? I said, yeah. You're a reductionist. I said, I'm fascinated by reductionism. I know at least 3 kinds. Which kind are you? Well, that was slightly difficult. So being a kind Irishman, I helped him out a bit. And I said, you know, I'm a methodological reductionist. I take a big problem, I split it into little problems, I study little problems and get insight in the big problem. I do that. I said, of course you do. That's normal science. Well, I said, we've got something to talk about then, haven't we? We needn't fight over that. But I said, I detect you're an ontological reductionist. That is, you believe everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. He said, exactly. Okay, I said, let's do an experiment. He said, what, here at the dinner table? I said, sure, this is Oxford. So I picked up the menu, and it wasn't very imaginative. It wasn't even written in French. It said roast chicken. So he said, what's the problem? Well, I said, let's have a look at this. R-O-A-S-T. I said, those are marks on paper. But I said, they have a semiotic dimension, haven't they? Semion, Greek sign. They carry meaning. Yes, he said, they do. Well, I said, okay, you're a reductionist, everything in terms of physics and chemistry. Please explain to me the semiotics of those letters in terms of the paper and ink. And there was a modest silence, and his wife was sitting beside him, and she said rather too loudly, in fact, get out of that if you can. But you know, to be fair to him, and he became a good friend, he didn't try. He said something that completely stunned me. He said, John, for 40 years, I've gone into my laboratory thinking that could be done. And it so obviously can't. You need an intelligence. I almost said, what, you mean an intelligence of the gaps? But I was too polite to say that. And I was so staggered. I said, but look, physics and chemistry have only been going decently for about 500 years. He said it doesn't matter. The nature of what is going on there demands intelligence. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it took R-O-A-S-T to do that. That's 5 letters. Tell me how people can look at 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right order. And you ask them, well, what about the origin of that? Whatever physical processes are involved, what about the ultimate origin? Oh, chance and the laws of nature. What? There's something very odd going on, isn't there? This is a perception. And the Apostle Paul says that the evidence of God is clearly perceived in the things that are made so that they are without excuse. They are without excuse. Because everybody now sees that word. Now I'm going to come to a stop now. But I want to remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that this is what Scripture puts its finger on. It says relatively little about the mechanisms of creation. But what it does say is, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things not were made. It does mean that, but it's not what it says. It says all things came to be through him, so that without him nothing came to be that came to be. It's talking about the things that come to exist as distinct from the Word that never came to exist but eternally was. So now we can put our worldviews in perspective that we started with at the beginning. Because the naturalistic or materialistic worldview starts with mass energy, and mind is derivative, and the idea of God, because there isn't a God. The biblical worldview puts that right the other way around. Because their word, mind, God, is primary, mass energy and everything else is derivative. So that's a choice we're faced with. Which worldview makes most sense? Well, forget Christianity for a moment. For me as a scientist, it's perfectly obvious which worldview makes most sense. It's in the beginning was the Word. Now, Genesis, of course, will gently unpack that for you. Its language is simple, but nonetheless profound for that. And God said. And God said. And God said. Have you noticed it comes a number of times, but not very many times? What is that saying? Well, I tell you what it isn't saying. It's not saying that it happened by a mindless, unguided process. And incidentally, I hope you've noticed that in Genesis 1, there are 2 days in which God speaks more than once. You've noticed that, have you? Day 3, day 6. And on day 3, the differentiation is made between the inorganic and the organic, non-life and life. On day 6, the difference is between animals and human beings. And you don't get from one to the other without "and God said." It's almost as if the writer had anticipated a contemporary debate, isn't it? Well, of course, the writer did. Because this is going to be the big issue. Do you get a universe without God speaking? No. Do you get life without God speaking? No. Do you get humans without God speaking? No. Now, here's the curious thing that I find just thinking about this abstractly. As Christians, we believe, well, if we're scientists, we usually believe there is a singularity at the beginning of the universe. The cosmologists are comfortable with that. The beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I find serious Christians believe in another singularity that happened 20 centuries ago, the resurrection of Jesus. What then is the in-principle difficulty with believing there were a few more? Why is it that in the biological world, among many Christians, they are desperate to avoid a singularity at the origin of life and at the origin of humans and at other places as well? What's the in-principle reason for doing that? There isn't any, except that biologists don't like discontinuities. Physicists have had to live with one forced by the science. And I just wonder, will the day come, as Kurt Gödel, the most brilliant mathematician of the 20th century, suggested it would, when there would be a mathematical theorem, he suggested, that proved that these things would be impossible. So the Bible is saying things that are seriously important. And I conclude with this, because you've been very patient. Just a little bit further on from that statement at the beginning of John, you read this: "In him was life, and the life was the light of men." Now, John hasn't yet got, in his very carefully written historical sequence, he hasn't got the incarnation. That comes much later. This is talking at an absolutely fundamental level. You just talked about creation. It's created life. Life is a light. And we need to think about that. If you see a light on a dark night out at sea, you always ask, where does it come from? And when you see life at all of its levels, from the bacterium to humans, you say, where does it come from? Where shall we get light on life, ladies and gentlemen? This is an astonishing claim. Where does all this life come from? In him was life. There is a magnificent vision in the book of Revelation. I wish I had time to draw it for you, to describe it to you. Where you discover at the very throne of God, it's vibrant with life at all of its levels, symbolized by living creatures, because it is the throne of the living God. Vibrates with life. God isn't some old tyrant who's tired of life and wants to annihilate it. He's its very source. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in darkness, ladies and gentlemen. Let me make a little suggestion. Since ultimately the source of life is to be found in God, try to explain it without him and you'll end in the dark. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I'll let you describe it again.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's late, and if you have to catch the number 6 bus, I'll understand it. But we have a little time for questions, I believe, and the powers that be will execute me when the right time comes. But in an audience like this, as I have said on many occasions, everybody is interested in everybody else's question. And so what we're going to do is not the normal Q&A. It's that we're going to collect half a dozen questions before I look at any of them, so that everybody in the room knows what the spectrum of the questions is. Now, there are a few ground rules. I don't want one question with 26 subsections. Each person, one question. Secondly, the time you take to formulate your question is time taken away from the next person. So do remember that, and we'll deal with as many as we can. Formulate it as a question, not as a speech to the Supreme Court, but a question. And I will write them down, and we'll see what the spectrum is, and then I will try and say something about them. So there are 2 microphones. Just come up to the mic, and there are 3, actually. And if you like, say who you are and what your question is. So you go ahead, sir, since you've come up
Hi,
first.
my name's Dave. Can you speak to the idea that pure mathematics can be used to point to an intelligent designer?
Thank you. Number 2.
Hi, my name's Tim. You spoke just about all night using basically logic to undo a lot of these things. And I guess my question is, what's the force of logic? Why is that so powerful? Why should we accept that kind of thing?
3.
I just wondered if you had a comment on the Higgs boson and sort of its relevance to creationism.
4.
I'm John. Much has been said tonight about mathematics, but I haven't heard much about the field of probability and statistics, what that speaks about concerning God's character and the whole notion of determinism versus God creating a random process. And
That's 2 questions already, but okay, we'll allow it. Okay, thank you. 5.
You mentioned the Turing hypothesis and a corollary about not getting more information out than what's put in. In that context, do you have any comments or observations on the extensive effort that's going into data mining and essentially what might be thought of as an attempt to get more information out of computers than what is put into them?
Okay. 6.
You made a point about Kurt Gödel and Gödel's number and solvability, I guess, of problems, and it went over my head. Could you repeat that?
Okay, 7, perfect number. Are we going to get the 7? Any advance on 6? Yep.
Hi, I'm Leonardo, I'm 15.
I can't hear you. Come to the microphone.
Is this working? Yes, okay. So from 2 observations. 1, we have matter, right? 2, we have information. Now, I also want to throw in another one in there. We have intellectual capacity, meaning we can argue, we can think. Evolution claims that everything came from matter. Everything's derived from a substance, right? So how does evolution address the idea that we are creatures that have the capacity to argue? Either I don't exist, or you don't exist, or this whole thing is a joke.
Okay, I've got it. Is there any more? There you go one. We'll make this the last one.
First of all, I'd like to say, Mr. Lennox, I love your accent. It's amazing. Secondly, my question is...
Well, I love your tie.
Thank you very much. Secondly, my question is, do you think that a level of pride blinds atheists to the actual fact of creationism, or the want to not actually be wrong blinds them to the information that lies right in front of them? Yes,
We've got it. Is that it? Right. Okay, let's have a look at these. Now, this is a Q&A. I could give a lecture on most of these things. You're not going to get it. You're just going to get a little approach, so you'll be disappointed. So be prepared for that. But that's a good thing, because you see, the work you do in answering your own questions is far more important than me helping you. We've got to learned to do hard work, ladies and gentlemen, if we're going to engage with our society. Now, these are very interesting questions, and I'm not going to take them in the order in which they were posed, because some of them relate to one another. I used logic. Why accept that? Well, you used logic in asking the question. We cannot avoid logic, sir. We cannot avoid rational discourse, and I'm going to come back to its nature in a moment or two. You would have to use logic in denying that we can use logic. You cannot opt out of that, I'm afraid. So that's a no-go area, which we'll have to leave there. Now, Turing and data mining. Well, as I understand it, not being an expert, data mining is precisely that. It's getting the information out from what is already there. It's not creating new information. It may be new to the data miner because, for instance, DNA is a vast database and we're trying to get out of it all the information, but we're not adding to the information that's there. We're simply finding out what is there. Now, somebody said that Gödel had gone over their heads. That's a very honest statement. It goes over most people's heads because it is actually very difficult. Gödel proved one of the most profound theorems in mathematics, that mathematics cannot be proved that it is itself consistent, and there's always will be, in a seriously sensible scheme of mathematics, true things that you cannot prove. And that has vast implications. But the point I was making was a simpler point. It's that once at Princeton, he was asked about the origin of life, and he said he seriously believed that one day there would be a theorem proved that showed mathematically that life could not possibly come to exist on the basis of random, unguided natural processes. Now, of course, that was Gödel's statement. He was quite a quaint character. He spoke in the third person, so he said, Gödel thinks that, and so on. So there we are. Now, Higgs boson. Can I say something about it? Yes, I can. The Higgs boson, they called the God particle, although Peter Higgs doesn't like it. And nor does he like the way Lawrence Krauss has produced it. I mean, this stimulated me to write an article because Lawrence Krauss published when the boson was discovered to a very high probability. He said the Higgs boson is arguably more important than God. So I wrote an article for the London Times, which is still online, saying arguably more important than God for what? I mean, arguably more important than God if you're explaining how particle physics works, but not arguably more important than God if you're explaining how there is a universe in which particle physics can be done. I mean, it's like saying that the law of internal combustion is arguably more important than Henry Ford. Well, it is if you're explaining how the engine works. It's not if you're explaining how it came to exist in the first place. So that was Krauss being extremely silly. And the Higgs boson, in that sense, if it has really been established, and they think it has, but they think it might be more complex than it is simply another very interesting and fascinating aspect of the so-called Standard Model. As far as I know, it has no theological implications whatsoever, except to confirm that there was a beginning which we've known for centuries. But that's not a bad thing. But it has produced a lot of fun, actually. I call it fun because I couldn't hesitate getting into this fray with Krauss because it is so utterly naive and it illustrates this constant mistake they make. It's arguably more important than God. So what he's saying really is that God is an explanation and particle physics and explanation are on the same level. They're not. God is an explanation in terms of an agent who designed the whole universe. He's not in competition with the Higgs boson or any other boson, fermion, lepton that you care to think about. So you can pursue that a little bit in what I've written, and there are various things online. You said I mentioned maths tonight. I didn't mention probability and statistics. Quite correct. We can't deal with everything. But I think sometimes, and I'm going to make one or two general remarks, I think the fine-tuning arguments do lend themselves to Bayes' theory arguments. If you're not interested in Bayes' theorem, forget it. But the work of people like Swinburne and various others, I think does have a lot going for it. The fact is that probability of the existence of God is increased if you definitely observe a fine-tuned universe. The problem is with this, it's not with the probability theory, it's with applying it to theories. So there's a whole big area there. But another point, and these are just random points because this is a big topic, we often talk, and Dawkins does, about the probability of God existing is very small. But as I pointed out to him, the probability of his existing is very small if you went back a few thousand years. And the probability of any of us existing, if you go back 5,000 years, is very small. But I think most of you would say, the issue is not how probable am I, but how actual am I? You calculate the probability that you exist. Well, so what? It'll be tiny. But you don't get stuck there. You ask the question, what is the evidence that I actually exist? And these are very simple things, but they catch people all over the place, it seems to me. So the real question is not how probable is God, although that's relevant in the Bayes' theorem argument. But the question is there any evidence that God is actual? And you don't base that on probability and statistics. You base it mainly on historical evidence and so on and so forth. You base part of it on probability and statistics. Then you raise the question of determinism, God's character, and all this kind of thing. Now, that's a huge question, and we do get problems with it, mainly, I think, because we cannot conceive how God can make creatures with the real capacity of choice. That's because we have no idea what time is, and therefore, by definition, we have no concept of God's relationship to time. I believe all that Scripture says about it. What Scripture says about it is a matter for another discussion. So, the final group of questions. Pure mathematics, the very first question, does it lead to the notion of an intelligent designer? And then the penultimate question went like this. We've matter, we've information, but we've also got something else, intellectual capacity. How does evolution address it? Very badly indeed. And this is one of the most important arguments. I'm glad you asked the question, because I had to leave it right out tonight because I saw that the time was approaching midnight. So let's go into that just for a few minutes, because this is massively important. One of the biggest reasons I have for believing in God as a scientist is that we can do science and that we can do mathematics and it works. Einstein saw the problem. Well, he was moderately bright, wasn't he? He saw the problem. The only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Eugen Wigner, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, wrote this famous paper, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. And what he meant by that was, how is it that a mathematician thinking in here with her brain comes up with an equation that describes the universe out there? How does that happen? I mean, the rest of us are so used to this, we don't realize this is a thing to be astonished at. Well, it isn't so much if you're a Christian, but it is if you're an atheist. Let's think about it. You said we have a mind and an intellect. That's right. And that's the basic thesis of Thomas Nagel's book, that our science has been successful up to a point because we have neglected the mind that's doing the science. What about the mind that's doing the science? Now, this could lead us into wonderfully interesting areas, but I'm going to just introduce a couple of things. Firstly, according to the atheist, the mind is the brain. And what's the brain? Well, to cut a long story short, it's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Now, let me put it to you. If you knew that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you use it? Would you trust it? I'm glad you're laughing because it means you see the point. Why can't Dawkins see it? You see, ladies and gentlemen, here's the irony of the atheistic position. Once you begin to ask it to account for the validity of human cognition, you run into a massive problem. Let's listen to an atheist describe the problem. John Gray, modern humanism is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. Long ago, the chemist Haldane pointed out, if the thoughts in my mind are just the motions of atoms in my brain, a mechanism that has arisen by mindless, unguided processes, why should I believe anything it tells me, including the fact that it's made of atoms? C.S. Lewis got this very clearly and pointed out it's like a person sitting on a branch of a tree and sawing the branch off on which he sits. But Alvin Plantinga has written a book called Where the Problem Really Lies. And that's well worth reading if you're interested in this question. Let me give you a central quote. If Dawkins is right, that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, or processes, as you call them, this kind of the Atlantic, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own science and his atheism. And now comes the punchline. His biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. Have you got that? Atheism undermines the foundational commitment of every true scientist to a belief, faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. That's why I reject it, ladies and gentlemen. It demolishes my science. And that's an argument that has nothing to do with God. But biblical theism is here perfectly coherent. But it tells you that the reason my mind in here could partly understand the universe out there is because both the universe out there and the human mind ultimately owe their origin to him. Final question. Does pride play a role? It does in all of us, not only in atheists. And we need to watch that, of course. Arrogance can affect any of us. And people are blinded because of their arrogance. Of course that happens. But you know, we mustn't go down that route at the first level. We must take people seriously. I can well understand, because I know many of them, brilliant people, and they have never heard anything else but that science is the only way to truth. It's not arrogance that's their problem often. It's simply that they are so in a sense, brainwashed, that they cannot conceive of any other possibility. And they feel they're opening their minds to possibly a lot of mythology, brainwashing of another kind, and so on. But we do have to realize that when rationality stops, you know, I learned a great deal of wisdom from an old Irish farmer many years ago. He said, if a man doesn't see reason, then reason isn't his problem. That'll save you an awful lot of wasted breath, by the way. If a person cannot see reason, reason isn't their problem. And of course, it is the fact we realize, and we haven't discussed this at all this evening, that science is one of the pointers towards God, but so is moral conscience. This is a moral universe. And there is an entirely parallel argument between, for instance, trying to get life out of non-life is trying to get morality out of non-morality. And because this is a moral universe, and because we're made in the image of God, whether people believe in God or not, they recognize morality. And it is interesting when you begin to talk about God, it raises moral questions. I wonder why, if there's nothing in it. And of course, the problem of the human will and resistance and arrogance comes in. And pride can blind us. We all like our pet theories to be right. Christians do, you know. There are Christians that will fight. How they fight about minor details of the Bible and scandalize the world. It looks ridiculous from the outside. I just don't know. Perhaps they don't believe the central doctrines. They're far more interested in fighting their own little corner. And often it's pride. And I can be guilty of that as much as anybody else. So we need to be aware that these things tar our feathers as well as atheist feathers. And perhaps a little bit of humility will do a lot of good at opening ourselves up and engaging. And this is going to be my last word, because this, I anticipate, is a mainly Christian audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to suggest to you that the two major problems you face are fear and shame. And because of fear and shame, many people my age and younger go to church, read their Bible, say their prayers, but they've long since lost any public dimension of witness because they're ashamed. They bowed to peer pressure. They've waited till they got that consultancy before they opened their mouth. They got the consultancy and they kept their mouth closed. We need to have a generation, and forgive me if I speak directly, because there's no point in me not telling you what I would wish to have heard at your age. Fortunately, I did hear it. You need to battle and get through the shame and fear barrier. Now, how do you do that? You say, goodness me, you've talked to us all day and all these arguments. I could never begin. Yes, you could. You could begin. How do you begin? Well, with one argument. And where do you get the argument? By reading 100 books on apologetics? Please, no. Those are very useful. Engage with somebody. Oh, but you say, if they ask me a question I can't answer, that's the end. No, it's the beginning. You tell them you can't answer it. And your honesty will speak volumes. Because if you pretend to know the answer when you don't, they'll write you off. But then what you do next is important. You go and find an answer and say, you know, I've never heard that question before. But I love to think this out because, of course, it affects my faith as well as your view. Do you mind if I go and find it out? Nobody will ever mind. You come back and you start discussing that. Then you find that'll lead to another question, another question. I have a little rule I sometimes use. I often break it, of course. When I meet somebody new, I keep asking them questions until they ask me one. You should try that. It's a very hard discipline for some people. But it is important, ladies and gentlemen. The Apostle Peter was the one that gave us our marching orders. Always be ready to give a reason concerning to anybody that asks you, to give a defense to anybody that asks you concerning the hope that is within you. Apologetics is an awful word. It ought never to have been allowed. It's a transliteration of a Greek word that makes defense. And we've turned it into a subdivision of Philosophy 101. All Christians in the New Testament did apologetics. People say to me, are you into apologetics? I say, aren't you? Because all it means is defending the gospel. Let's get rid of this notion, it's Philosophy 101, and get back to the New Testament idea that this is defending the gospel, and you cannot open your mouth in a pluralistic secular culture without people asking your questions, and there you're into it. Notice what Peter says. We often quote that verse as I quoted it, context-free, but there is a context. Do not fear their fear. That's the problem. Peter got scared. It's recorded for us in the New Testament. You get scared. I get scared. Do you think it's not scary debating Dawkins? Well, then you haven't begun to think. So what's the secret? Our knowledge of argument, that's important, but here's the secret. Sanctify in your hearts Jesus as Lord. That Christ is your supreme value. And be ready to give an answer. It's your attitude to Christ as the Lord of your life that's the key to this. And ladies and gentlemen, let me say another very provocative thing. It is a complete contradiction in terms that you enjoy your Christianity without sharing it with other people. Thank you very much for being so patient.